Hello and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Today we're talking about Armenia's attempt to pivot geopolitically and to put that within the context of the history of the Third Republic. So we have with us Dr. Arman Grigoryan from Lehigh University. Hello Arman, welcome to the show.
Thank you for coming on.
Hello, Asbed, and hello, Hovik. Thank you for having me.
Professor Grigoryan, as this is the first time on our show, please tell us about your background, interests, and research for our listeners.
Okay, so I was born and raised in Armenia, and I received my college education at the Yerevan State University, my first degree in the Middle East Studies department, specializing in Turkish studies. Right after graduation, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work for the first post-communist government of Armenia. I worked in the analytical unit that was created by Girar Libaridian, first at the parliament, and then we moved to the president's office after the presidential elections of 1991. So I worked at the president's office in that analytical department for 2 years. In 1993, I left for the US to continue my education. I got a master's degree at the University of Chicago in specializing in international relations. And then I was accepted to the PhD program at Columbia, where I did my PhD with Jack Snyder and Bob Jervis being my dissertation advisors. I wrote a dissertation about third-party interventions, or actually it was a little more broadly conceptualized how third parties in general affect state-minority bargaining and how sometimes third-party involvement produces escalation in state-minority conflicts. Shortly after that, I was hired at Lehigh, and I've been there ever since, publishing papers on various aspects of state-minority conflicts, interventions, as well as U.S. foreign policy, international relations theory, etc., etc. So that's pretty much it. I can't say anything else about my background.
Well, I think it's definitely some of the names you mentioned, Jack Snyder especially, is definitely very interesting to hear what it was like working with him, but maybe we can discuss that in passing. But anything you can recall? In fact, your paper has mentioned references to his book, so I would love to talk a little bit more about, I guess.
He was frequently cited in the research paper.
If I'm mentioning my teachers and mentors, I should also not neglect to mention that I worked very closely, and they were my first mentors at the University of Chicago. I worked very closely with John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt and also Gene Fearon. These are also people who have had a major influence on me, and I'm still in contact with them. And I've been very, very lucky to have the teachers that I've had in the United States.
Arman, in April of this year, you published an extensive research paper titled Revolutionary Governments, Recklessness and War, the Case of the Second Karabakh War. For our listeners, we've included a link to the abstract in our show notes, but the PDF of the full article is paywalled, unfortunately. In the early stages of the paper, you make the point that as he came to power in 2018, Pashinyan held the position that negotiations were a waste of time if the process was not culminating in a status for Artsakh and maybe in exchange for some of its surrounding territories. So his logic put both Aliyev and the OSCE Minsk group in front of a dead-end situation, which would lead to war. You also make a strong case that Pashinyan was fully aware of the military disadvantage of Armenia vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, which had outspent it in defense capability 5-1 for the previous decade. So given the case that you are making, how does one explain the disastrous path that Pashinyan put Armenia on?
Yeah, so before I answer the question, I want to bring up a caveat. It's very easy sometimes to read my article and my criticism of Pashinyan's diplomacy and Pashinyan's behavior and the Armenian government's diplomatic posture and get the misconception that I'm criticizing the overall preferences of the Armenian side. I'm criticizing or I'm rejecting the justice of the Armenian position. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing the opposite. I'm agnostic about those issues. My focus is solely on the diplomacy as far as it was justified by the distribution of power and by the diplomatic environment. And what I am arguing is that often, and this is one of the fundamental theories and approaches to the study of war in international relations theory, when you look at war as a bargaining problem. And the idea is that every conflict has a Pareto optimal solution, to use a little bit of academic jargon, which is better than fighting. So every war ends eventually. And the parties, in principle, could have agreed to that outcome exposed without paying the cost of war, and both of them would be better off. And then the real puzzle of war is why parties fail to reach that outcome and why parties they incur the waste of the costs of war in life and treasure. And the answer is either private information about capabilities and results, things that you can't possibly know about the adversary's capabilities, and the adversary cannot reveal credibly those advantages without jeopardizing their position, or there are commitment problems in the sense that if you agree to some deal, the adversary has incentives to renege on that deal, which is what prevents parties from reaching negotiated bargains. And the argument I'm making is that none of those logics really explain the Armenian government's behavior, really explain the Second Karabakh War, because there was no way for reasonably disagreeing about the real distribution of power before the fact, before the war. And there were also credible guarantees in case a deal was to be made. That deal would be guaranteed by the Minsk group and most importantly, by Russia. So the puzzle is not resolved by the standard logic, the standard rationalist logic. And what I argue is that this was a case of systematic irrationality on the part of a revolutionary government, which based its predictions, which based its calculations, if we can call it calculations, on things other than the distribution of power in the diplomatic environment. And they believed in basing policy on aspirations, on will, on determination. Sometimes it's even difficult to understand what really was driving their logic, their decision-making. There is considerable evidence, and I cite some of it, where they simply argued that material constraints and the material reality is essentially secondary to aspirations and the will to achieve those aspirations. I mean, I cite one of the things that struck me and scared me to death, actually, shortly after Pashinyan came to power, was his speech at the Sardarabad Memorial in 2018, on the 100th anniversary of the First Republic and the Battle of Sardarabad, where he literally said the victory at the Battle of Sardarabad was not due to any material reasons, diplomatic, military, economic factors. It was solely the result of Armenians' belief in victory. I mean, this really conveys the man's mindset and the mindset of his revolutionary team, and he has made many other statements to that effect. So I think it was a willful and philosophically committed attitude toward material reality, which was essentially contempt for material reality, that drove this government's decision-making, and that ended in the disaster of that war and its outcome. Let me just make one last point about this, which is very important. Not only it was predictable, the outcome was predictable, and the balance was easy to calculate for anybody with access to the internet and a computer. I mean, 2 months before the war, the Armenian General Staff submitted a report to the political leadership where it gave a very pessimistic assessment, including a prediction that there may be serious Turkish involvement in the upcoming war, and that the war is very likely in the near future. So when you have such an assessment from your general staff, you got to take it seriously. But if you look at the actions and some of the things that they did after that warning, after the warning of their own general staff, and also after some very critical, very stern criticism from Russia, our main ally, it was after those warnings and those criticisms that the Pashinyan government engaged in that circus with regard to the Tavush incident and giving 75 medals to the soldiers and organizing a military parade, humiliating Aliyev essentially. And also the statement about the relevance of the Treaty of Sevres and joining coalition in the Eastern Mediterranean against Turkey. The foreign ministry made a statement to that effect. So if anything, the behavior became even more bellicose after the warning of the general staff. So really, any attempt to explain it by rational calculations and missing information, etc., seems to me not the path to understand the decision-making process of the Pashinyan government.
Yeah.
But I also do want to highlight that even publicly, they were making statements that we do not think that Turkey will be involved. So it seems like they, in their hand, had information and reports from their army saying that there's a high chance of Turkey's involvement, which would be critical in any outcome of any war. And then publicly, they're reassuring the people that, no, it's okay, they're not going to get involved. So I don't know how to explain that either.
Arman, you propose two interesting potential hypotheses to try and explain why the Armenian side behaved so recklessly in leading to those defeats. The first is about the intellectual and political ecology in Armenia, and the second has to do with the nature of revolutionary governments. You have expanded on these ideas in your paper. Can you discuss your points a little bit for us?
Sure. When I just described Pashinyan's worldview, his penchant for basing policy on grand aspirations, on the focusing on the justice of those aspirations and the will to achieve them, etc., etc. I mean, Pashinyan and his team did not emerge in a vacuum. It wasn't like in Armenia you had intellectual and political atmosphere which was inclined toward rational decision-making, rational calculations, and all of a sudden these bunch of revolutionaries come and bring their zealotry and bring their recklessness to the political arena. The Pashinyan team was in some sense a product of that ecology which had formed in Armenia for the couple of decades before the war under Robert Kocharyan and Serge Sarkisyan. And that ecology was characterized by the dominance of a set of strategic myths, which was designed to maintain the status quo, which was designed to create the impression, create the political environment where people thought no compromise is possible, first of all, and secondly, that it's not dangerous. And I make the argument that the previous regimes, the regimes of Kocharyan and Sarkisyan and their satellites, had vested interests in doing so. I mean, there is a section in the paper where there is always a tendency, especially in the literature in international relations, where you talk about ideas and you take ideas as independent variables. You take ideas as the fundamental causes of certain policies. I reject that view and I reject that approach, at least in this paper. And I argue that these ideas actually were rooted in certain material interests and certain material reality, namely, the interests of these regimes and their satellites. And there is a coalition there, which I describe. Again, we can get into it in more detail later. But they were interested in maintaining the status quo. And when I say they are interested in maintaining the status quo, this can be framed slightly differently. They knew full well that if there was a peaceful resolution, a lot of them might have become politically irrelevant. In Armenia, that was at peace with its neighbors, and that had solved its conflicts with Azerbaijan and Turkey. A lot of political forces in Armenia would have become irrelevant. And so that's the sense in which I think I'm claiming that they were interested in maintaining the status quo. But if you maintain the status quo in the face of the growing gap in the capabilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as the very visible shift in the diplomatic environment, where the Armenian position was becoming less and less popular and acceptable internationally. You have to convince the people also that there is nothing to worry about. And for 20 years, that's what the Armenian political elite was busy doing, and lulling everybody into this comfort zone and convincing even themselves that there is nothing to worry about. They had decided on their own what Russia's interests are, for example. I mean, there are videos of people representing the old regime, Seyran Ohanyan and Moses Hakopian and people like that, saying there's nothing to worry about. No matter what, Russia will come to our aid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Russians were telling them, there are certain parameters, there are certain things you have to do, and we can't support the extension of the status quo indefinitely. We can't sign up. We can't underwrite the Armenian position. No matter what, we decided that essentially the Russian threats were not credible. And if you assume that the Russians are going to stand beside you no matter what, you also assume that Turks will be deterred, because that's what Russia has been doing since Armenia became independent and since the conflict in Azerbaijan escalated. So there is really nothing to worry about. That's what they had done. They had convinced themselves, they had convinced the public, and it was not too difficult to do, because they had the main instruments of disseminating these ideas. They controlled the media, they controlled the television, they were dominant, they had dominant positions in the educational and cultural and academic systems, and there was nothing essentially counteracting that in Armenia. So that's the environment, that's the intellectual and political environment that gave birth to Pashinyan. Now, Pashinyan added some revolutionary zeal to it, and instead of actually doing what the previous regime was doing, which was just simply dragging his feet, pretending to negotiate, promising to do this or that after the next elections, Pashinyan essentially withdrew from negotiations, which presented both the Minsk Group and Azerbaijan with a starker choice. So that's essentially my argument, and that's how I link Pashinyan intellectually and psychologically to the existing environment in Armenia.
But for a long time, Pashinyan has also been regarded as a disciple of the first president, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, and he espoused his principles of mutual compromise, maybe unlike the compromises that Kocharian and Sargsyan were interested in making. Do you regard Pashinyan's 2018 administration as a revolutionary new government, or an evolution of Ter-Petrosyan's interrupted roadmap, let's say, towards peace? And also, one more thing. Do you think that the events of March 2008 were essentially a first attempt or a precursor to what happened in 2018?
The events of the crackdown. Okay, so about this genealogy of Pashinyan, which is one of the most contested issues in Armenian political debates. Obviously, especially after the war, everybody was trying to portray Pashinyan as not their person, but the other guys. And here's the thing. I need to gather my thoughts about this, because I have a lot to say about this, actually. As I already pointed out, I kind of already answered your question. Pashinyan's ideology and outlook and philosophy was, in a sense, a continuation or a product of the 20-year period of myth-making, strategic myth-making, and rejection of compromise, and the intention to maintain the status quo. And as I said, he subscribed to a lot of these myths, and he just added, he increased the octane level of that mythology, if anything. Now, why do people make the claim that Pashinyan is the disciple of Ter-Petrosyan? So a lot of this is just vulgar politicking, and the traditional opponents of Ter-Petrosyan, who actually are the intellectual progenitors of Pashinyan, wanted to dissociate themselves from Pashinyan and his ideas. Now, after the war, they started claiming that Pashinyan is, let me just say the Armenian word, Hogatu, giver of Armenian lands, right? I mean, he wasn't the Hogatu, he was defeated, right? He was defeated in war. Armenia was defeated in war. It wasn't like Pashinyan just took and gave those lands to Azerbaijan. It was clearly the consequence of the war. So the claim itself is a little strange. I mean, that kind of framing is a little strange that he just gave up Armenian lands. It was the consequence of the war. And as I argue, the war itself was the consequence of this intellectual and political ecology. But of course, they just had the incentive to dissociate themselves from Pashinyan. And immediately they jumped on him. They started calling him these names. And they started claiming that Pashinyan was a disciple of Ter-Petrosyan's, because after the war, Pashinyan signed that ceasefire agreement, and he started negotiating. And I mean, a few months after that, he changed his tune completely, and he didn't just start talking about the need for peaceful resolution with neighbors, which of course in his case was a consequence of defeat rather than philosophical evolution. He went too far in that direction, according to many, according to me as well, trying to portray every Armenian position and every Armenian aspiration as unreasonable, unjust, and stupid. And he just went overboard, and he did things that he said things that nobody in Armenia had said among people who were in favor of compromises and resolution of conflicts with neighbors. So I think it is mostly politically driven. And Pashinyan of the period of 2018 and 2020, I mean, why even, I mean, I shouldn't even focus only on that period. Already when he split with Ter-Petrosyan in 2013, and he drifted away from the Armenian National Congress, and he changed his tune almost immediately. And he started giving speeches and making claims that were even more radical than the speeches and claims of the card-carrying hardliners in Armenia. He criticized Ser Sarkisyan for negotiating. He argued that Ser Sarkisyan is selling out Karabakh. There can be no compromise in Karabakh as long as Aliyev is using this threatening and belligerent rhetoric. Any talk of compromise on the part of Armenia is tantamount to treason. I'm not quoting him verbatim, but that was the essence of his argument. And in that same speech, which was, I think, in 2016 or 2017, in that same speech, he pilloried Ter-Petrosyan, and he went after him really harshly and argued that Ter-Petrosyan is supporting Ser Sarkisyan's diplomacy because he wants his arguments to be vindicated. Right? So that was the motive of Ter-Petrosyan, according to Pashinyan. So Pashinyan had become extremely hostile to Ter-Petrosyan right after the split, and his rhetoric and language were again, if anything, were more hardline than the rhetoric of the card-carrying hardliners. Moreover, I think if you look at Ter-Petrosyan and Pashinyan, or Ter-Petrosyan and pretty much everybody. And by Ter-Petrosyan, I mean Ter-Petrosyan and his political team. The fundamental difference, I think, between them and everybody else in Armenia for the last 30 years has been, on the one side, you have had Ter-Petrosyan and his team who have been committed to realism and materialism philosophically, the idea that there are material constraints, that there are material realities that nobody can ignore without terrible consequences, that Armenia's policy should be firmly based on the calculation of these material constraints, and and Armenia's aspirations should be adjusted to its capabilities and what is possible to achieve given the diplomatic environment. And everybody else in Armenia for that entire period has been talking about that philosophy and that approach as defeatist, as treasonous, and everybody else has been talking about Armenia's aspirations and historical rights and trying to and I'm talking about even the period of the early 90s when some of the people in opposition were trying to present a resolution abrogating the Treaty of Kars, for example, right? And which was tantamount to issuing territorial demands against Turkey. I mean, these are the people who are talking about Pashinyan being the disciple of Ter-Petrosyan. Nothing can be further from the. I think philosophically they are very, very, not just very different. They are the opposite of each other. And philosophically, given his dedication to aspirational thinking and his commitment to the strategic myths, I think Pashinyan is firmly in the same camp with the people who are making these accusations. It's just for political reasons they are distancing themselves from him. If I may, just one last point. I mean, one of the arguments that is brought up to justify that claim is that Pashinyan has been in Ter-Petrosyan's team in 2008 and between 2008 and 2013. Look, everybody has been on Ter-Petrosyan's team in Armenian politics over the last 30 years, with the possible exception of Karen Demircan. And if you focus on that fact, everybody becomes Ter-Petrosyan's hokezavak, as they call it. Yeah. So I think that argument is simply silly.
Yeah, we talked with Levon Zurabian on our show, and he gave a similar answer to yours. Although I think that
all great minds think alike.
But what I do want to add that I don't believe that the political association was only between 2008 and 2013. Prior to 2008, Pashinyan had a long career in journalism, and I believe the content of his newspapers is very much supportive of Levon Ter-Petrosyan. So I think ideologically, there is an argument to be said that until 2013, Pashinyan largely supported the views and ideology of the Armenian National Congress or Armenian National Movement before. But I think that it's interesting that, as you said, sometime after 2013, when Levon Ter-Petrosyan actually seemed to get closer to Ser Sarkisyan and offered his support if Ser Sarkisyan would negotiate with Azerbaijan on and compromise, as Ser Sarkisyan and Levon Ter-Petrosyan got a little bit close to each other, Pashinyan took a more hardline stance, it seems. I think this is a very interesting discussion. I have a lot of questions about Pashinyan and LTP relationship, but for the interest of time, I think we're going to forego this because we can be arguing about that for hours. But let me go back to something you said in your paper about the role of strategic myths. You argued that Armenians had developed a set of myths that led them to overestimate their own potential, underestimate the enemy's potential, and even worse, they created a strong environment that was basically against any compromise. First, I want to ask, knowing what you know now, in all honesty, do you believe there ever was a time that compromise was even a remote possibility given Azerbaijan's stance? I mean, in 2000, even going back to 1996 or 1997, do you believe that there was a point in time in history that if our Armenian government said, yes, we will compromise, if Levon Ter-Petrosyan had not resigned in 1998, that there would be some kind of a deal where Armenians would live in Artsakh, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and they would be the masters of their own destiny, hopefully have a state or some kind of a semi-statehood?
I mean, it's not a matter of opinion. Azerbaijan had agreed to that. And one of the most important errors that people make when they talk about the credibility of such an agreement, whether it would stick, is to focus the argument on whether Azerbaijan would exploit its advantages later on, whether Azerbaijan would have incentives to renege, sort of like, I already briefly discussed this commitment problem issue in the study of war. And that's kind of the logic that a lot of people rely on to make the argument that absolutely no deal was possible that would be stable, and Azerbaijan would always have incentives to renege on any agreement and exploit its advantages. Now, when bargains are struck, usually you get mutual hostages. I mean, the bargain would involve certain things that would make it very costly for Azerbaijan to renege on that agreement. But I don't want to focus on that because that actually I think is secondary. The most important thing is that it would be guaranteed by Russia and the Minsk group. The Russians had had no incentive, as I pointed out earlier, and as I argue in the paper, to underwrite the Armenian position of freezing the status quo indefinitely. But the Russians also had no incentive to allow Azerbaijan to take over Karabakh or to run over Armenia, and Russians were willing to underwrite a certain agreement which would create such a bargain and which would make both parties dependent on Russia in a sense, right? And Russians would be guarantor of that deal, and the Russian guarantee essentially would be an instrument of maintaining Russia's strategic dominance in the region.
Hey everyone, you are listening to the Groong podcast with our guest, Dr. Arman Grigoryan. Let's take a moment to thank our listeners who have contributed and have become sustaining members of our podcast. Thank you so much for your support and show of appreciation for the work that we do. Go to podcast.groong.org/donates if you haven't done so already and become a sustaining member.
Indeed, thanks to each and every one of those source sponsors, Lahmacun luminaries, and Harissa humanitarians who have signed up. We hope you appreciate the content that we're bringing you. We're doing this as a labor of love, and we absolutely love setting up these shows and doing them for you. And today's guest is also the first time on our show. As you see, that we try to bring you diverse opinions and opinions from experts in their fields.
How often is it that people can hear somebody with the insight and research background of Dr. Arman Grigoryan in English?
Well, I don't remember Dr. Grigoryan actually giving an English interview, so not very often. And you can get exposed to Dr. Grigoryan's research in scholarly articles, in journals. But I think we all appreciate that scholars of this caliber also can come on our show and can share their thoughts, even if we don't agree with some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, our goal remains to reach an increasing segment of Armenians, both in the Republic as well as in the diaspora, and also diplomats who do not have easy or in-depth access to what's going on with Armenians in the Republic or abroad. Your support will help us achieve the goal of informing this important community of people who are part of Armenian life around the world. So if you haven't done so already, please go to podcasts.groong.org/donates and become a sustaining member. We appreciate your contribution in advance.
Thank you.
Back again to our conversation on Groong with Dr. Arman Grigoryan.
I realized that in 1998, no one could foresee a major war in Ukraine where the U.S. So I realized that argument that no one could tell the future. But as we see today, even the strongest beliefs, like I think that most people, 99% of Armenians, would not believe that Russia would pull out of Artsakh and essentially would stand by as it was ethnically cleansed. So times do change. And I think that one of the main arguments against this was that peacekeeping forces always could go wrong. And they could, there have been examples where peacekeepers have failed in their duties. So that's essentially my point. And I mean, in hindsight, is 2020, but I think the biggest argument was that in 1998 was that we would rely on peacekeepers to guarantee. But here we have a clear example that didn't work in 2023.
Okay. So first of all, you're absolutely right. We could never have predicted what would happen in 2023. So any argument that the opposition to the deal in 1998 was because some people could predict or could have reasonable fears of what might happen in 2023 is just not a serious argument, right? But
there were already examples of failed peacekeeping missions.
So there are two kinds of peacekeeping missions. The one kind of peacekeeping mission is when a bunch of countries under UN auspices concoct a deal and send a bunch of Belgian and Pakistani soldiers there who have absolutely no stake in the conflict. And the first bullets are fired, and those countries pull out their peacekeeping missions. And that's kind of the typical image of we have of peacekeeping missions, and partly it's justified. Now, there are other kinds of peacekeeping missions. Nobody's talking about the success of the peacekeeping mission in in South Ossetia. What happened in 2008? There was a peacekeeping mission there, right? In fact, it was a Russian peacekeeping mission, even though it was authorized by the UN, but it was essentially a Russian peacekeeping mission. What happened in 2008 when Georgia violated the ceasefire there? The peacekeeping mission worked perfectly. Not because peacekeeping in general works perfectly, but because in that case, Russia has a stake in the outcome of that conflict. Now, Russia had a stake in the outcome of the conflict in Karabakh as well. And as I said, Russians had powerful incentives to make sure that there is a deal, which they were the guarantors of, and which maintained a certain balance between Azerbaijan's and Armenia's interests. Now, what happened in 23? First of all, you're right. Nobody could have predicted the war in Ukraine and how that might have affected the calculations of the parties, and that probably did affect the calculations of the parties. But it wasn't simply the fact that, well, Russia was too busy and Russia was fighting this very difficult campaign in Ukraine and it didn't have the resources and the energy. So Russians essentially gave up on Karabakh. This is something that I want to make sure I'm not making statements that are not backed up by strong evidence. This still needs to be studied, what happened in 2023. People who make such claims are absolutely confident that it was the consequence of Russians making a deal, the Russian commitment there being not credible, and the Russians just simply pulling out. I think we probably should pay attention also to some of the arguments that the Russians are making as to what happened there and what kind of role did the Armenian government's behavior play in contributing to the Russian decision to wrap up its peacekeeping mission there. So a couple of things are very important to keep in mind. In the ceasefire agreement, the paragraph 9 was one of the most important paragraphs, which envisioned opening this communication between mainland Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan, which was supposed to be guaranteed by the Russians and policed by the Russian FSB forces. Now, it wasn't just that. There was also an understanding that whatever Armenians had in Lachin, whatever the status of Lachin was, whatever the regime in Lachin was, the logic should be equivalent for that corridor. Now, we were very unhappy. I was very unhappy. The Pashinyan government was very unhappy with that prospect, even though essentially under threat of continued war and worse consequences, he signed that ceasefire and agreed to that paragraph, agreed to that demand. But then he started dragging his feet and he refused to implement that deal. Now, this wasn't a position that undermined Azerbaijan. It was also a position that undermined Russia's position as a mediator, all right? And after the war in Ukraine escalated, it wasn't simply the fact that Russians got too busy in Ukraine and weren't able to protect the Armenians and to live up to all their obligations and commitments. It was also the Armenian government essentially deciding that, well, we don't know how the Ukraine war is going to end. We don't know if staying with the Russian inside the Russian orbit and in a security system dominated by Russia is the most reasonable prospect for Armenia. In fact, some of them thought this is an excellent opportunity to bolt out of the Russian orbit and to reorient the country toward the West. And they started forum shopping and they started negotiating with Azerbaijan in Washington and in Brussels. And the Russians were clearly very unhappy about that. So the fact that the Armenian government also assumed this posture, I don't think we can ignore the effect of that behavior on the Russian decision-making. Let me also make one point about this. And again, this should all be taken with a grain of salt. We don't know exactly what happened. This needs to be studied more carefully in the future. But it was also quite disturbing for me when last year, one of the high-ranking members of Pashinyan's team, Pashinyan's party, gave an interview and pretty much said September 19, 2023, which is the day when of the Armenian exodus from Karabakh, is the real day of independence of Armenia.
Liberation, yeah.
The liberation of Armenia, because essentially that has deprived Russia of an instrument of pressure on Armenia, an instrument of blackmail on Armenia. Pashinyan gave an interview shortly thereafter to Petros Ghazaryan, and he didn't articulate it quite as bluntly and as clearly as his comrade from his party, but he pretty much hinted at the same thing. We can't ignore these statements and these arguments, and actually it's in the air in Armenia that now we want to have a clean break. We want to have a full normalization with Azerbaijan, which leaves no lingering problem, no issue of status to be determined in the future, etc., etc. And this frees our hands to do whatever we want in our foreign policy, namely and most importantly, to reorient the country strategically toward the West, or as they call it, to pivot to the West. So I don't think we can ignore these elements and these issues whenever we talk about what happened with the Russian peacekeeping mission. I think the Armenian behavior and the Armenian position, at the very least, contributed to this. And one last thing about this, again, I mean, I don't argue that we should take the Russian statements as statements of indisputable truth, but the Russians argue, and they have made this argument on several occasions, that essentially when Pashinyan went and recognized Karabakh unconditionally as part of Azerbaijan and recognized Azerbaijan's sovereignty unconditionally and without reservations over Karabakh, first of all, that went against the Russian preferences, who were arguing that the peace treaty should not determine the status in the first phase, that there should be a peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan that leaves the status undetermined. And so this went against the Russian preferences. And also Russians have made the argument that that recognition was done without any consultation with the Russians, and the Russians were essentially presented with a fait accompli, and it was hard for them to justify their continued presence in Karabakh, their continued peacekeeping presence in Karabakh once Armenia had done that. Again, I'm not willing to stake my reputation on this being the case, but these are things that cannot be ignored, and these, at least it's not a fact. It's not an indisputable fact that Armenia was doing nothing to contribute to that decision. Russians simply packed up and left, and their peacekeeping mission was not credible from the get-go.
So given this complex situation that you've painted, why did Pashinyan decide to, as you call it, drag its feet on the so-called Zangezur corridor, given that he had expressed similar ideas all the way back like 20 years before?
What ideas? I'm sorry, I'm not.
Why did he drag his feet on point 9 of the statement?
In 2001, he had an article, Menking Kmershahed, We and Our Interests, where he exactly spelled out that the east-west corridor connecting Turkey and Azerbaijan should be in Armenia's interests. And yes, it is against China's and Russia's interests. So at least he was toying with the idea of a geopolitical polar shift, I guess, for Armenia. If this was so much something that Pashinyan wanted, why did he drag his feet on that?
So first of all, I mean, this is an opportunity to address briefly something else that was left unanswered earlier, namely Pashinyan's much more peace-oriented, much more compromise-oriented approach in the period you're referring to, even before he joined Ter-Petrosyan's camp. Yes, he went through that period, but the fact is that after 2013, he completely changed his tune. And I don't know how much of it was political opportunism or which part of it was political opportunism. Maybe it was his peace-oriented arguments and the attempts to curry favor with that camp at the time. That was a case of opportunism, and maybe what he was arguing after 2013 was really his genuine outlook and philosophy. But again, that's not terribly important. What matters is after 2013, he became something that was even more radical than most card-carrying hardliners, and that's just the fact. Now, as far as the corridor issue is concerned, it's one thing to have a negotiated peace. It would have been one thing to have negotiated peace and full opening of communications and lifting of blockades and having a negotiated regime for these corridors and for these passages connecting Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan, Azerbaijan and Turkey, and being a part of the larger project of connecting Central Asia to Turkey, etc., etc. So that would have been one thing. It's a totally different thing when you sign it under duress and when it essentially compromises your sovereignty. And I will confess that when I saw the ceasefire agreement that very night, when I saw it, and when I got to paragraph 9, blood went cold in my veins. I also thought that was terrible. That is creating some kind of, there is a cloud hanging over southern Armenia, and we have all known about certain Azerbaijani and Turkish aspirations about that region. So it's that anxiety combined with the fact that the issue was being discussed in the context of a defeat in war and an agreement that was signed under duress. So it was quite unpleasant, and Armenia had many reasons to resist that and many reasons to offer alternatives to the Zangezur corridor. But one of the things that Pashinyan has been saying is that the key issue was the presence of Russian FSB troops there. I mean, this seems to have been one of the most important reasons why Pashinyan and his team, I mean, again, I'm just saying what they have been saying. They have articulated it clearly. It's not an attribution, right? So they much prefer to do it with Western guarantees, with Western support, and without the Russian control, quote unquote, of that corridor, right? And one of the interesting things in this context that should be mentioned is the recent visit of O'Brien, the Undersecretary of State of the United States, or maybe he's not an undersecretary, but he's in charge of Eurasia. I don't exactly remember what O'Brien's position is, but he's a high-ranking person in the State Department in charge of this region. And he was in Armenia a few weeks ago, and he gave an interview to Azatutyun, to Radio Liberty, and he very clearly, I mean, I was surprised as to how clear he was, how unequivocal he was in his statement. So he said two things. First, that Russia should be excluded from that project. Russia should have no role in whatever comes with regard to opening these communications that link Azerbaijan to Nakhichevan and the larger project of linking Central Asia to Turkey and Europe and the rest of the world, and that Russia should be excluded from Armenian-Azerbaijani negotiations about the peace deal. So it shouldn't be guaranteed by Russia because of Russian dominance, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so O'Brien was very clear about the linkage between Russian mediation of these issues and what consequences it will have for the continued Russian strategic presence in the region, and how they think of it as a zero-sum issue, and how they would like to thwart it, and how they stand behind the Armenian government's decision to do exactly that. So that's what's happening with regard to the corridor, but it's not just the corridor, it's the larger issue of the Russian strategic presence here and who is going to guarantee the Armenian-Azerbaijani peace agreement. Whoever does that is going to maintain a stronger strategic position in the South Caucasus, and the Armenian government is trying to make sure that it's not Russia.
So while we are all fixated on sovereignty, Pashinyan, you're saying, is more fixated on Russian control of that corridor.
And
Yes.
my question, another way my question was going to be, is Pashinyan truly concerned about sovereignty, or he's concerned about who he's going to give up that sovereignty to?
Here's the thing. I mean, we have to be careful in making this argument. I think objectively, it may be the case that, in effect, Pashinyan doesn't care about sovereignty or compromises on sovereignty, but Pashinyan cares more about whose vassal Armenia will become. Okay?
Right.
But it is also likely, and I think it's more likely, that Pashinyan's team and also a lot of people in Armenia think that having that kind of these kind of compromises with Russia does compromise our sovereignty, because Russia is so bad. Russia is an imperial state and wants to restore its imperial domination over the South Caucasus, over Armenia, whereas the West is an epitome of human rights, democracy, international law. And what they will do is not compromise Armenia's sovereignty, but actually restore Armenia's sovereignty if it's the Western guarantee of these things. So I think regardless of what the objective state of affairs is, I think there is that sort of mindset among a lot of people in the Pashinyan team and among a lot of the supporters of Pashinyan.
Okay, well, so I think this is a good pivot to your next article that we want to talk about, which was published in the National Interest. It's called Armenia's Misguided Pivot to the West, and I believe it was published last week. And obviously, you talk about O'Brien's visit in that as well. You also talk about how the Western-Russia rivalry or relationship has become a zero-sum game, whereas in the past, there were some areas that there was clear cooperation, such as the OSCE Minsk group.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we talked a little bit about the fact that essentially Pashinyan's team is replete. I mean, there are people from different camps, but a significant number of people on Pashinyan's team, including the foreign minister, I could argue, and the National Security Council secretary. They are all of the sort of, I guess, sorry for using that term, but proteges of George Soros and the pro-Western and anti-Russian camp. So do you believe that these people, when they were originally on Pashinyan's team, and I believe the National Security Council secretary was in that position from day one since 2018, do you believe that prior to 2020, they had different ideas in terms of Armenia's geopolitical orientation and they flipped, as in pivoted? Or do you think that maybe this was an idea that was baking and actually being implemented since the first days of 2018, the change in power?
Not just 2018. I think when they were in opposition, they were already very clear in their preferences. They criticized Ter-Petrosyan harshly for abandoning the association negotiations with the EU in 2014 or 2013. I don't remember now. They harshly criticized Ter-Petrosyan for that, and they argued that Armenia should abandon the economic cooperation organization dominated by the Eurasian Union. I keep forgetting the acronym of that organization. But anyway, the Russian response to the EU and the Russian dominated customs union and
the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU.
the Eurasian Economic Union. That's right.
But before that, it was a cooperation something. Yeah, you're right.
Eurasian Economic Union and the Customs Union, Armenia should abandon it, and Armenia should definitely restore or resume negotiations rather with the EU, and that should be what Armenia should pursue. Armenia should become part of the West. Armenia should be oriented toward the West. I think their kind of pro-Western outlook was quite easily visible then. And actually, it was not the positive pro-Western attitude so much as the very clearly pronounced attitude that the close alliance and relationship with Russia is a compromise on Armenia's sovereignty, is a break on Armenia's development politically and economically. It's an obstacle to that development. And the sooner Armenia breaks those bonds with Russia and creates bonds and creates relationships, close relationships and ties with the West, the better and faster its chances will be for developing politically and economically. They thought, I should say with some justification, that the kind of relationship Armenia had with Russia and the kind of relationship the Armenian elites had with Russia kind of contributed to the sort of political system in Armenia, and it is not entirely unreasonable to argue that the Russians were comfortable with the sort of regimes like Kocharyan and Serge Sarkisian. And in fact, in some of my interactions with Russians and Russian colleagues, when I've criticized them for that, I've argued that it took real genius to turn one country to create in a country that, like Armenia, an anti-Russian sentiment, because that was one country that could be simultaneously democratic and pro-Russian, but a lot of your policies contributed to this, and there is some truth to it, right? But again, it's one thing to be critical of that and to have issues with that and to present it to the Russians and to bargain with the Russians and in fact to have some disagreements with the Russians. It's another thing to have this outlook of completely reorienting the country's strategic orientation. Now, after they came to power, they kind of realized that doing it abruptly and radically was going to be very difficult. For one thing, the situation in Karabakh, situation with Azerbaijan was, the tensions were becoming very high, and having an open confrontation with Russia at the time would be too irrational even for Pashinyan's government. After the war, clearly they were very dependent on Russia and very weak, very disoriented. They didn't know what to do. But quite quickly, they decided that there is some political benefit to scapegoating the Russians and arguing that the war itself was the consequence of some Russian-Turkish deal, Russian-Azerbaijani deal behind Armenia's back, and it wasn't the consequence of our diplomacy. The Russians, of course, were not the only scapegoat. After the war, everybody and their best friend was responsible for it, except the Pashinyan government. I mean, Levon Ter-Petrosyan was responsible for it because he didn't conquer Baku in 1994, which is why we had the war in 20. I mean, seriously, I've talked to members of the Pashinyan government who have made such silly arguments, right? So Russia was part of that entire PR campaign to find scapegoats, and that certainly would have had consequences. That would have annoyed the Russians terribly. Now, but that aside, the anti-Russian rhetoric and this campaign of bolting out of Russia's strategic orbit and reorienting the country to the West and pivoting to the West, that rhetoric and that atmosphere in Armenia became much more intense right after the conflict escalated in Ukraine. And I already mentioned why I think that happened.
Yeah.
I mean, they simply thought that Russians are too busy and too weakened by it to protect Armenia against Turkish and Azerbaijani pressure. But more importantly, I think this is the more important motivator for Pashinyan and company. They thought that was an opportunity to finally get serious with their policy of reorienting the country strategically.
So, Professor Grigoryan, you also in 2020, you wrote an article called Selective Wilsonianism. And there you describe how the United States is essentially very selective in where it intervenes. Also, going back to your article about the misguided pivot, you bring up that essentially the West is, you didn't use this word, but the West is basically inciting Armenia to go against Russia without any short-term protections. And, I just want to note that unlike Ukraine, where the West is doing that at a much greater scale, Armenia not only has one large enemy to deal with, but it has two, one on the west and one on the east. And also, let's not forget Russia itself, who will be very pissed off about this. Also, Iran, is not excited about Western influence on its borders. So what is going through the minds of Western planners when they're thinking about this? Is Armenia basically viewed as a pawn that they can sacrifice in this game with Russia? Or is there some other big picture that we're maybe not seeing?
I think the West's attitude also changed after the not after the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, but after Russia started doing well on the battlefield. Now, the relationship already shifted after the escalation of the conflict because, as I point out in that article, even though there were conflicts and tensions between the West and Russia for quite a very long time, the conflicts were not zero-sum. And after the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, they did become zero-sum. And when it becomes zero-sum, and you are engaged in this titanic battle with a big adversary, there is a temptation to tell the smaller countries you're with us or you're against us, and force them to take sides and make it very difficult for such countries to have equidistant relationships or cooperative relations with both, or remain just simply neutral. Anyway, so the current attitude, I mean, I don't think that it's a monolithic opinion among Western elites. I've talked to a lot of diplomats and analysts who have argued that Armenians are behaving very recklessly with this pivot to the West, which suggests that the initiative is not from the West, but it comes from Armenia. Again, I don't know if well, let me put it this way. In the West, you do have people, certainly, who for a long time have thought Armenia was trying to knock Armenia out of Russia's orbit, was a bridge too far. It's too ambitious in a sense, and also it's not worth it. I mean, what's the strategic value of Armenia to go to such lengths? And also it creates dangers for Armenia itself. And given the strategic benefits of doing so, the costs for both Armenia and the West probably outweigh the benefits. So that has been the thinking among many people. But as things have started becoming worse and worse for the West in Ukraine, even those small benefits for a certain segment of the American and Western elites has become an attractive option, right? If you can create another hotspot for Russia, another headache for Russia, it's probably worth it. And we shouldn't be surprised and we shouldn't be scandalized by making such claims and by attributing such motives to at least part of the Western decision-making elite, because they say openly, they have been saying this openly. In Ukraine, it's very cheap for the United States. It's not terribly costly conflict for the United States or for Western European countries. We just give money and the Ukrainians are doing the dying. I mean, sometimes I'm shocked that they articulate this so clearly. So I wouldn't be surprised that the same people who make such claims about Ukraine think it's not probably a bad idea to encourage this Armenian behavior and maybe create another headache, another hotspot for the Russians, right? But again, I do think that it is not a pressure on Armenia to do so. At best, it's an encouragement of Armenia to go that path. And I think the main initiative, I actually do think that the initiative comes from the Armenian government. It is a manifestation of their fundamental preference of reorienting the country to the West. They think it's the path to paradise. It's the path to stabilize democracy and economic and technological development. As long as Armenia doesn't do that, it's doomed to be stuck in this underdeveloped state, in this unstable political environment. Once Armenia becomes the part of the West, democracy, human rights, rule of law, economic development, all good things will happen. And even if one doesn't dispute that, you were absolutely right in your question. The matter is not, I mean, we can put aside a lot of the hypocrisies in those views and a lot of the shallowness in seeing the West in such light. The West's record is not quite as clean as a lot of pro-Westerners in Armenia think. But even if we put that aside, I mean, this is going to trigger a very, very strong reaction from Russia. I don't have any doubts about that. Not only Armenia, if it abandons the Russian security architecture, the Russian-dominated security system, not only Armenia is going to become vulnerable to Azerbaijan and Turkey. I haven't seen any evidence of the West saying that they are ready to provide such guarantees to replace the Russian security architecture, the Russian-dominated security architecture. Russia itself is going to become the enemy. I mean, since 2008, Russians have drawn that very bright red light that beyond the Baltic states, any attempt at political and strategic integration of former Soviet republics into the West is not going to be tolerated. And as they have shown in Ukraine, they're ready to go to nuclear escalation to prevent that. I don't understand how anybody in Armenia can think that even though they're doing that in Ukraine, even though they did that in Russia, somehow they're going to tolerate that in the case of Armenia. Again, whether Russians are right, wrong, it just doesn't matter. This is something that we simply have to take into account when making our decisions. Moreover, they have picked a really interesting time. The Armenian government, the Armenian elites, the pro-Western elites have picked a really good time to bolt out of the Russian orbit and to jump on the West bandwagon when everybody and their best friend in the West is talking about the end of the unipolar system and the crisis of the West and the rise of Russia and China and the BRICS and all of that. I mean,
right.
And when you say 2008, you're referring to the cases of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, right?
Yes, I am.
Professor Grigoryan, I want to take a quick segue into the Turkish involvement in the war. In your article, you mentioned various different causes for the war, where you also talk about Turkish involvement, but you also talk about the mythology that the previous governments had created. You talk about how irrational the revolutionary, that is Pashinyan, is. My question is about Turkey specifically. Several days ago, in fact, Erdogan boasted of their involvement in Artsakh when he was threatening Israel with the same fate. We know that Turkey had a significant role in the war in Artsakh. We know that their special forces were present. We know that there were reports that at least one part of the war was being managed and coordinated from AWACS aircraft flying over Turkey. Turkey had several generals stationed in Azerbaijan. So the question is, there are multiple obviously contributing factors, but could the fact that Turkey was involved be the single most critical and most decisive factor that determined the outcome of the war before it even was started?
I don't know if I want to make such a strong claim that it was the single most decisive factor. It interacted with other things. It was certainly a very important factor, but whether it was the single most decisive factor, I don't know. And I'll explain what I mean by that interaction. Now, the first thing I want to say in that regard is I already kind of mentioned it. I mean, I kind of assumed in my argument, and I do assume it in the argument in the paper, that it was a part of the changed diplomatic environment, right? So when I talk about the diplomatic environment, not just the balance of power, dyadic balance of power between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Well, part of the changed diplomatic environment is Turkey's very active role, increasingly active role in Azerbaijan, increasingly active presence in Azerbaijan. But the most important interaction here is the rapprochement between Turkey and Russia. Now, this is usually presented as a conspiracy, as a backdoor deal. I mean, this was also out in the open, and again, as part of that rapprochement, Russians were more eager to encourage a settlement of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. And I think given the Armenian resistance to go for a negotiated solution, essentially Russians lit a yellow light. And instead of the kind of standard deterrent posture that they've had vis-a-vis Turkey for all this period, that Turkey cannot have any involvement in the South Caucasus, in the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, there was probably some Russian yellow light there to Azerbaijan and Turkey But I think that was given Armenia's intransigence and unwillingness to go for a negotiated solution. So the very fact that the Russians didn't object and the Russians tolerated it, and after the war they created that thing in Agdam together, and they had a very cooperative relationship after the war. It wasn't acrimonious. It wasn't Russians accusing Turkey of getting involved and whatnot. So I think it was one of the most important factors and one of the most important changes in the diplomatic environment. But it wasn't just the Turks. I mean, Israel has had a very deep involvement in Azerbaijan and helped Azerbaijan to build up its capabilities. And there are also there are stories about them not only selling the weapons, but also teaching them, training them, helping them use it. Pakistan was involved.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
So,
essentially, I think that modern wars increasingly rely on intelligence, or ISR, basically intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And that was like sort of, it's always in my mind when Turkey as a NATO power has access not just to its own satellites, but to hundreds of NATO satellites. And I know this is complete speculation on my part, although some analysts have sort of mentioned this, but could it be that also all of that NATO intelligence brain power was used? And there are obviously stories that in the first 15 minutes of the war, like all the most important targets were obliterated by Azerbaijan. So I believe that critical information about the locations to target was decisive as well. So, and then therefore, maybe it was Israel that provided all the intelligence. I'm not sure, but someone provided Azerbaijan.
given Azerbaijan's dominance in the air and possession of the drone technology, which is not just a strike platform, but also an intelligence platform, right? I think, and the Armenian air defenses were quite incapable in terms of dealing with that technology. And I think there was a lot of really important intelligence gathering by Azerbaijan itself, but it's entirely possible that Turkey, not only possible, very likely, and I think it happened, that Turkey also helped with its intelligence capabilities to provide these targets and to manage the operation. I mean, it went beyond that, certainly. I think, right. First of all, a significant part of the Azerbaijani army was trained by the Turks to NATO standards. And the operation, I think, was designed in the Turkish General Staff. I think it was Turkish generals that designed the operation. It was a very impressively designed operation and very well executed operation, I must say. So yes, the Turkish involvement has been significant. There is some talk about Turkish special forces being involved in combat operations, but even if they weren't involved in combat operations, that's not the most important thing. I mean, there is no question about the very deep Turkish involvement and support of the Azerbaijani operations. And as I said, one of the most important things was that it was tolerated by Russia at that time. Now, when we talk about Turkey being a decisive factor, I'm not attributing this to you as the person asking the question, but sometimes this point is made to argue that the war's outcome was unpredictable because nobody could have predicted the Turkish involvement, right? And everybody in Armenia, in the Armenian General Staff and the political leadership assumed that they would just have to deal with Azerbaijan and that was more manageable. That actually is not true. The Turkish involvement was visible before the war, quite visible before the war. The Turkish-Russian rapprochement was quite visible before the war, and we should have made appropriate adjustments to our policy given that rapprochement. And most importantly, I do know that it was in that very same General Staff report, the prediction about Turkish involvement and how that would make Armenia's task insurmountable militarily. And also, I do know that throughout the year 2019, the Armenian intelligence service, the National Security Service, has issued a bunch of warnings about the very close Turkish involvement and the Turkish presence in Azerbaijan and how that might play a big role in a war if a war were to happen. So this is not something that we learned ex post. This was visible ex ante, and it should have made our diplomacy even more cautious, but it seemed not to have any effect on our calculations.
All right. This has been a very interesting conversation, and we could go on for many more hours, but let's leave it there for today. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Grigoryan.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
And Dr. Grigoryan, thank you. We hope to have you back again because we left many questions out because we were just having so much fun talking about what we talked about today. Really, thank you for your time, and we hope that you can come back soon.
Thank you very much, and I will forward to future conversations with you.
We look forward to it. That's our show today. This episode was recorded on July 31st, 2024. We've been talking with Dr. Arman Grigoryan, who is an associate professor of international relations at Lehigh University. He has a doctorate in political science from Columbia University in New York and a master in international relations from the University of Chicago. His research has appeared in various international security and political science journals and reviews. For more on Dr. Grigoryan, please check his bio through our show notes. Please remember to support us. Go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and become a sustaining member of Groong and give monthly. Thank you in advance. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
Please follow us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.